Yo, what's good everybody? Hope y'all doing well. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the modern trap drum bounce, and I'm going to explain every detail for the entire process of making trap drums. So with all that being said, let's just jump right into it. Okay, so opening up my first project file here, I'll just play like a snippet of it so you kind of get the idea of the type of bounce that I'm going for. This drum bounce usually sits between the tempos of like 140 and 170 BPM. This type of bounce is prevalent in pretty much most modern trap music, so understanding these fundamentals will make it insanely easy to make pretty much any other subset of trap. And so I just want to go over one quick thing before I jump into anything. I'm primarily going to be using the piano roll, and what this means is in the channel rack, you have all your different sounds. So right click on it and then left click on your piano roll, and that's going to open this menu where you place all your notes. Another thing that I want to discuss is the snap to grid. So if you go up to the top left of your piano roll here, you're going to see this magnet icon that's probably green. For pretty much most of these drum sounds, I'm going to be using the line setting here. So just left click on that. So the first thing I want to cover for this standard bounce is a snare. Most producers will either use like a clap or some sort of hard hitting snare similar to this. Other sounds would be like a clap similar to this, or maybe some unique type of snares. So whatever you prefer, you can kind of play around with your sound selection, but generally speaking, it's some sort of hard hitting percussive sound. We have all these hitting on pretty much the same spot on every measure. So usually what I'll do is I'll start just with one, and this will be on the third beat of the first measure. And basically all this means is that it's sitting on the middle line here. If we're looking at the line snap to grid, you can see the little grid lines and then also the slightly thicker ones too. So if I play the metronome, you can see that it lines up with these. So basically on that third click, you're going to place your note, or in other words, it's this middle line in the measure. Once I have this, I usually go up to the top measure here and select this using right click and drag, and then hit Control B a few times until it fills out the rest of my pattern. Usually these are either 4 measure or 8 measure patterns, and I'll just play it by itself real quick so you can kind of get a gist of what it sounds like. So the main variation that I've seen with this sound is that you can place notes somewhere out here or somewhere out here. All you're really doing is you're just shifting it over 1.5 of those metronome clicks over. You can see that there's this middle line between the more major lines here. So this is 1 line, 2 line, and then we're going to place it right in the middle right there. The middle is sometimes also called the offbeat, so I might refer to it as that later on. So when I say offbeat, it just means that it's somewhere in the middle here. It's not on the more solid grid line. So usually this will be on the offbeat after the first beat of the measure. So this is the first beat right here, and the offbeat right after that would be there. And that'll create more of a bounce like this. Sometimes the velocity on this first note will be a little bit lower to kind of build up to it. The other variation is pretty similar to that, where you have it on the offbeat or the end of the fourth beat. So if we're looking at our metronome clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this little line between the fourth and the next measure. And that bounce sounds something like this. Another variation that I've seen used that's not super common is putting it on the beat right after. That sounds something like this. It's a little more uncommon, but I've seen other producers use it before. So now moving on to the hi-hats. So in order to get the basis for this hi-hat pattern, what I usually do is I go to my channel rack here and I spot my hi-hat and I'll right click on it and then go to fill each 2 steps. And this gives you like the standard trap 2-step hi-hats. And so what I mean by 2-step, it just fills in every other one of these line slots here. And the basic 2-step pattern just by itself sounds like this. And in context with our snares, it sounds like this. So that probably sounds kind of familiar because a good percentage of trap beats use this general basis where you have 2-step hats with those snares that hit on the third beat of every measure. And so how I like to go about putting rolls in for these is I'll go up to the snap to grid that I mentioned earlier, and I'll typically use the 1/2 step, 1/3 step, and 1/6 beat snap to grid. And I'll usually take the paintbrush tool right here and just fill these in with rolls. So let's say for example, I'll go with the 1/2 step snap to grid. And let's say we go to the end of the second measure. And what I'll do is I'll just select this one note here. So the notes I place will end up being that same note. And I'll just go in and just draw in my rolls like this. Just click and drag. You can set your roll at the same pitch as the rest of your hi-hats and it'll sound something like this. Some ways that you can spice this up, the first being you could just move your rolls to different pitches above it, or below it. Another thing you can do is leave some gaps. So for example, I might just do like 3 and then fill one in right here. Or if you want to make like an ascending or descending roll, what you can do is press and hold shift and then click and drag it, and also change the notes too as you're doing it. So it'll look something like this. So I'll click right here and then drag down, and I'll get a roll that sounds like this. And same thing with the ascending roll. So you can just play around with that, try the different variations. And so I'll just show y'all the other snap to grids that I like to use, and you can kind of hear the difference between the rolls. So I'll go to the 1/3 step snap to grid and just put in those same type of rolls that I showed y'all. Typically what I like to do with a 1/3 step snap to grid is leave the last note empty so it has a little different bounce to it. And also make those rolls with it. They sound a little bit more cohesive with the 1/3 step rolls. And then lastly, I'll go over the 1/6 beat snap to grid. I tend to use these more so at like the end of measures, just to kind of tie the bounce back into the beginning. And same thing, you can pitch them down, make rolls with them, whatever the heck you feel like doing. So just combining a bunch of those different types of rolls and pitches and all that, you can get hi-hat patterns that are a lot more complicated that sound like this. By the way, that MIDI's from my Resonance multi-kit. So now moving on to the next sound, which is the secondary snare sound. So going back to the line snap to grid here, the main thing I want to focus on are these and beats again. So in other words, if we zoom out far enough, you can see that there are those little faint lines in between the actual beats. So if I play the metronome, they're going to hit in between the two metronome clicks, exactly in the middle. You pretty much want to design these around your original snare pattern as a counter. And so this lower note right here is going to represent the main snare. So the most common places for these counter snares are shown right here. Like I said, it's really heavily reliant on the off beats. Typically what I've heard in beats or seen other producers do is they'll just use some sort of variation of this. They typically won't use all of these notes. They'll drop a few of them. So for example, I'll just take these two out, or I'll take the last two out. Whatever you feel like doing, just try to place these on some sort of off beats. I've also heard some beats where the snares are placed on the downbeat or where the metronome hits, and that sounds something more like this. So it's kind of a different bounce to it, but pretty much like the hi-hats, just kind of play around with your placement with them. Just know that pretty much anything on these off beats are probably going to sound good. And then for the rolls, I use a pretty similar strategy to the hi-hats, where I use the 1/2 step, 1/3 step, or 1/6 beat snap to grid and just draw in the rolls. So jumping into a different FLP, I kind of want to go over what like an end roll or transition roll would look like. And it sounds kind of something like this. So how you go about constructing a snare roll like this is go up to your snapping. I think this one is using the 1/6 beat snap to grid. Similar to the 1/3 step snap to grid, you kind of want to leave a space right here, let the bounce do its thing, instead of just having it like this. So leaving that little gap definitely helps out with the bounce. And then down here, I'm basically just skipping every other note and then just kind of rolling them off low. So it kind of builds more anticipation for the next part. And kind of in context with the rest of the drums, it sounds something like this going into the next part. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the 808, but we'll cover that later. So now moving on to the open hats, and these are relatively simple, most of the drum sounds. In terms of placement, going back to our line snap to grid, these will typically sit on the second or fourth beats of the measure. So I'll just place a note on pretty much any of these typical spaces right here. So this middle note right here would be where our primary snare goes. So basically it's just one metronome click or one beat before or after that primary snare sound. So for example, if I just cleared this out and just had it on the first one or right after it. I've also heard open hats hitting on this type of pattern right here. It's kind of more common in like Detroit and West Coast music, but I've definitely heard it in trap before. You could also just sync it up with your 808 notes and kind of make a condensed version of that. You can also make your open hats hit on those middle snares to kind of give it more of an accent. All right, so now moving on to the Percs. So I've got this other beat right here, and this is kind of just for the sake of demonstration, but I've got this Perc sounding thing. This kind of just hits similar to where an open hat would, but it kind of hits in succession. You could do this with pretty much any type of perk, so I'll switch it out with a different perk. I'm gonna just go to the perk section in my multi-kit right here and get something like this. You can also put it at the end of a measure. You can also do 3 in quick succession instead of 2. So you're gonna be filling up all those lines right here. This usually works better with shorter perks, so I'll use the zap sound instead. More percussive sounding perks like rims and stuff, you can place it as like a quick little 3 at the end of the measure or on the second, but you can also kind of treat it similar to a snare where it hits on these and beats, kind of something like this. Alright, so now moving on to this new FLP, this is a more pain sounding beat. And so now moving on to the 808s portion of this. These are just hitting on the root notes. They're basically just the bass notes of my piano. And with this pattern, I'm just gonna demonstrate the typical spots where 808s hit in trap beats. And I'll make like a secondary version of it right here. So these are the typical spots. We have the first beat of the first measure. We have the and of the second beat, or in other words, 1.5 metronome clicks away from the beginning. Then we have the fourth beat of the first measure, the second beat of the second measure, and the and of the third beat of the second measure, exactly halfway between the third and fourth beat. Typically 808 patterns are within these 2 measure groupings. At least most of them kind of stick to this sort of pattern, and then the cycle kind of repeats itself. And for the second cycle, I have a slight change where instead of on the first measure where it hits on the first measure, instead of the last note hitting dead on the fourth beat, it's on the end of the fourth beat or halfway between the fourth and the next measure. Playing all these notes together kind of sounds something like this. So these are the most used notes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to be playing all of them. So kind of similar to the snares, I'm just going to go through and just kind of trim out the notes that I don't want. And so I'll start with something like this. And then same for the second, move this back to the fourth note, and then I'll take out this note right here. So my first 2 measures will sound something like this. I'll make a second version of this, like an alternative version, that'll be slightly different, but it'll kind of have the same general bounce. So again, we have that same general triplet bounce to it. I'll put this in context with all the other drum sounds by themselves. And then for the last measures, I have something like this where I have like these 3 hitting, and I have a little switch up at the end. My bass note changes it here at the end just so it kind of builds back up into the beginning. Typically this type of switch up will happen on the first beat of the last measure or the third beat. And to spice up this last note a little bit, I'm gonna go up to the slice tool here and I'm just gonna make a couple cuts. I'll have a roll that kind of looks something like this. And this is a pretty standard and basic sounding roll. And similar to the other stuff, you can always just delete some of the notes. I'm gonna go back to this FLP here where we went over the snare rolls, and I'm just gonna go over 808 rolls and kind of how they play into the rest of the beat. Typically, if you're gonna make an 808 roll, you wanna make these hit on those tension notes. In other words, you want it to hit on the notes in the scale that are a half step apart. So for example, for C sharp minor, those notes are gonna be D sharp, E, G sharp, and A. For the most part, if your 808s are hitting on those notes, you should be all right. But again, it just depends on the beat, so play around with it, make sure it sounds right to you. So for this beat right here, I kind of have a more basic roll where I'm just using the line setting. And usually what I like to do for 808 rolls, I typically like to dedicate the whole second half of the last measure or the entire last measure to it. And similar to the snare rolls and the hi-hats, I'll sometimes use the 1/2 step, 1/3 step, and 1/6 beat snapping and just kind of play around with those. So playing this in context with my other drum sounds, including the snare roll, this 808 pattern sounds something like this. Another 808 roll that I got in this beat sounds something like this too. And this last part right here is using the 1/3 beat snap to grid, and you can just see it hits on all those lines right there. And the rest of it's using the line setting. So similar to the hi-hat rolls, use that paintbrush tool, the snappings, everything, and just get real creative with it. And also the last thing for drums, I'll just go over some slight arrangement stuff. So if I'm going between different sections, sometimes what I'll do is I'll go to the last measure and I'll just chop out all the drum sounds after the snare hits. That way it kind of gives the beat some room to breathe before it goes into it. You can always add some transition sound like a reverse crash or riser, something similar to this. So pretty much anything of that sort. Also, you don't want all of your drum sounds playing all the time throughout the beat. As you can see, I kind of have these sections where all the drum sounds out for the sake of spacing, or I just take 1 or 2 of the sounds out. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're arranging your beat. All right, that's going to do it for this one. Hope y'all enjoyed it. And that's going to do it for me. So I'll see you on the next one.